In this section of the Moodle book, we will look at how underpinning attitudes and philosophical perspectives have influenced early years culture and the general culture of education in the UK throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Let's start by going right back to 1588 to 1679. Thomas Hobbes was a very famous philosopher because of his interest in the human condition in relation to the sort of political context in which the human being grows and develops. Thomas Hobbes believed that young children were inherently selfish, dare I say even use the word evil, and that it was society's role to kind of condition the child to become good, so to strip away the kind of selfish elements of the child and to use sort of the external social factors to help raise children into respectable citizens. Hobbes saw that adult control was a method of doing this, and that the state had a responsibility to ensure that children were told how to behave as sort of respectable citizens. Moving forward, we have John Locke, 1632 to 1704. So, in contrast to Hobbes, Locke recognises that human beings do have the ability to sort of self-control and self-regulate, that humans are rational by nature and can actually resist temptation to kind of act selfishly, even without the kind of social factor that Hobbes said was necessary to ensure that. So Locke says that the child is actually able to organically develop the kind of self-regulation strategies required, and because they are rational in nature, that they can help to make decisions and that they are valid in and for themselves in many ways. And in stark contrast to Hobbes's philosophy of the child as kind of selfish and evil in some ways, Rousseau constructed this idea of the child as the noble savage, this idea of the child as pure and innocent and able to kind of actually change society for the better. So flipping Hobbes's idea on its head and saying that the child is the origin of goodness in the world, and if we work with the kind of human spirit and allow the child to grow and develop according to its own sort of genetic plan, then we can actually help to change society as a result. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the final person we looked at there, also influenced Froebel, if you remember from the previous video. And Rousseau sees the child, as I say, as an innocent, and it's society's role to allow that child to be nurtured and to grow in according to its sort of natural form. So in many ways, seeing the child as like an organic matter that grows in its environment. And obviously this raises questions about the nature-nurture debate. So you might want to pause the video and reflect on whether you think the child is a construct of its environment, or whether the child is a construct of its natural kind of innate genetic components, or whether it's actually a mixture of both. And I think today, hopefully you paused that, but actually I think in today's society we recognise that it's a mixture of both the genome, so as in the DNA of the human being, and also in the way it's in its environment as well, because the environment actually influences how cell structures take shape, and so has a strong influencing factor. We also know now that regardless of the kind of biological and genetic propensities of a person, if you give them a warm, loving, caring environment and an effective education, then you can actually compensate for some of those genetic propensities as well. So spend some time discussing that with yourself or with a friend or colleague. Do you think that it's the result of the human being is the result of their nature or their nurture, or a mixture of both? And if you agree both, then how much of nature and how much of nurture? So the reason why it's important to kind of look at the historical and philosophical context of how early years education has emerged in the UK is because it's useful as practitioners and as professionals to understand why we do things in the way that we do. To illustrate this, have a look at the picture on the left here and this classroom, which looks quite sort of Victorian in style. You can see the chalkboard there with the alphabet on, and no doubt there was lots of repetition and rote learning going on. In this environment, the teacher is the one obviously fully in charge, and the one who is all-knowing and has that knowledge which they are going to impart to the child. the child in this instance is a passive receiver of that information. And up until around about the 1950s, that is what education looked like. It was seen as this imparting of knowledge and wisdom from one person to another, the transmission of information. And if we look back in philosophy, that makes sense, because actually it's a very Hobbesian way of looking at things, in terms of we need to shape the child, we need to domesticate the child and create what we think is a model citizen through environmental factors. On the flip side of that, education, contemporary education in the UK today, adopts a much more organic approach, a more hands-on approach, in which the child is facilitated in their learning. So rather than it being more about, you must learn this, here it is on a plate, it's much more about activities that the child can engage in, and actually learning through the process of enjoying themselves at the same time, rather than just having to sit there and receive information. They are much more hands-on, so to speak. And in the same token as well, they recognise this concept of the unique child in early years education, which is very much this idea of that Rousseau had, of the child as having unique characteristics, and the role of society is to shape that child. Well, in the early years settings, that's what practitioners are doing. They're setting up an environment in which the child can grow according to who they are, and not necessarily being told what they have to do, explicitly kind of said that they must learn this, that, or the other, but actually just being enabled to experience the world and to discover for themselves. So this shift in education from this very didactic approach of the teacher stood in front of the classroom imparting knowledge, to a more student-centered approach, is mirrored in the kind of movement that we saw in the 20th century from behaviorism towards constructivism. So there's a key difference between the two. A behaviourist sees learning as very much a conditioned response, a transmission of information and the reinforcement of when you get it right, so to speak. So, good boy kind of thing, correct, that's the right answer, having a right or wrong, towards a more constructivist approach that you can see on the image on the right here. It's much more interpretivist. It's much more about how we shape meaning and how we encounter the world. So a constructivist sees the subject, or the individual human being, as able to create their own meaning, which is going to be distinct from somebody else's, whereas the behaviourist says, no, there's one fixed objective truth, and that is to be known and can be known, whereas constructivist says, actually, no, there's no such thing as fixed objective truth. We've just got to work with the subject and create these learning experiences and actually learn together. So obviously it's a sliding scale, but teachers tend to put themselves on there in some point in their career as either more of a behaviourist approach teacher or more of a constructivist approach teacher. But equally, sometimes a lesson might lend itself more to behaviourist methodology, and other times it might lend itself more to a constructivist methodology. One easy example is the teaching of mathematics has a very clear right or wrong answer, so you're likely to find behaviourist strategies really successful there, whereas art or kind of literacy, writing poems or anything that involves more subjective experience is likely to benefit from a constructivist approach. Discussions and things like that as well are very much more constructivist. But as a whole, we've shifted in the 20th century from a behaviourist paradigm in education towards a constructivist one, and this is certainly echoed in the early years culture, whereby we see this concept of the unique child being, who they are and how we're going to help them be nurtured, grow and develop, just as Rousseau and Froebel and actually Montessori and all of the other pioneers would have wanted us to achieve as educators today. And here we can see the shift in art from a very sort of realist perspectives, where we see art as trying to record the exact truth of reality. It's very behaviourist, scientific truth idea, positivist kind of thing that in research methods we would call them a positivist, because they believe that the truth is fixed and out there, towards much more impressionist kind of subjective truth things. You've got Van Gogh in the middle there and his sunflowers. They are his sunflowers. The sunflowers are the sunflowers that he sees, just as the sun is warm because he feels it on his skin. There is no such thing as the sun on its own. He creates the sun through a sort of chemical process of being. And then move through to surrealism and this idea of the subjective actually being a myth in itself, and just breaking down all barriers and becoming very surrealist in that approach. But again, you can see how artwork through the 20th century and before and after kind of mirrors this way of thinking from behaviourist paradigms to more constructivist paradigms. So hopefully, if you haven't already fallen asleep, you can name at least 2 pioneers of education who have influenced early years education today, and also you might be able to explain the cultural shift in education that's happened between the 20th and 21st century. Have a go at putting that in your own words and trying to make sense of that and think about what it means to you, because as myself, I'm a constructivist teacher, so I think the only way of really learning what I've just talked about is to make it make sense in your own way. So have a go at doing that.